Good evening and welcome to tonight's Zoom program. I'm Em, I'm one of the librarians here at Rockland Public Library, and we're thrilled to be hosting tonight's author talk. I want to start the night off with a couple quick programming notes on upcoming virtual events this month at the library. Next week on April 15th, we'll be showing a virtual film screening of Whose Streets, a documentary about the Ferguson protests and the Black Lives Matter movement. And the following week on April 22nd, we'll have an Earth Day themed poetry reading by a group of local poets. And I'm happy to introduce tonight's speaker. Katie Fisher is a queer New England-based writer of authentic, heartfelt LGBTQ+ narratives. KD grew up all over the United States, bouncing from North Carolina to Hawaii to Illinois, and finally settling in Maine, where they spend far too much time at the beach. When Katie isn't writing, they can usually be found hiking with their overly enthusiastic dogs, obsessing over plants, or cooking elaborate meals. They love classic country, perfectly ripe tomatoes, and falling asleep in the sun. And I'll turn it over to Katie. Go right ahead.
Great. Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I'm going to be reading in just a minute a little section from my book that came out just in last October of 2020. It's called The Secret Ingredient, and it is set in Maine. It's kind of set in a fictional town. I didn't want to set it in like Portland or anything, but basically the two towns are kind of analogous to Portland and then like some kind of mid-coast type town. So yeah, it's a lesbian romance with two characters, one who is from the Midwest and she moves up to Maine to kind of start this really fancy high-end restaurant in the Portland. It's called South Bay. It's kind of like Portland. So she's starting this really fancy restaurant and it's like a lot of pressure on her. And then the other character, Beth, owns this kind of really farm to table-y cafe restaurant up in Mid-Coast. And yeah, they are rivals at first. They don't really get off on a great foot, which you'll hear in my reading. And then they fall in love because it's a romance novel. So I will go ahead and read for a few minutes. I'm just going to read one chapter from the book. It's the second chapter after we're introduced to Ada, who has just moved to Maine. Like I said, she's a single mom, so she and her son have moved up here. And the book is told in alternate point of view, so every other chapter skips between the two main characters' perspectives. And so this is going to be in Beth's point of view. And yeah, all right, I will go ahead and read from chapter 2. Let me just find my place. Okay, so again, this is from Beth's point of view. All right. The flames wandered over the kindling, sparking golden as the rich scent of wood smoke filled the kitchen. It was early still, the sunlight weak and soft. Outside, the clear crack of Andrew chopping wood mingled with the cries of chickadees and jays. Inside, I was alone. I drew in a deep, steady breath to greet the dawn. I was exhausted. The night before had been long, with a private event yawning long past midnight. The morning came too early and too busy. My to-do list snaked through my mind unrelenting. Update the menus online, proof the boules, fill the tart shells, pick up the blueberries from my dad, answer at least 50 emails, follow up with vendors. Realistically, I needed to hire someone else. But the last two guys I'd brought on didn't have the right energy. They cut corners and didn't connect with our mission. The recent onslaught of guests and publicity meant, however, that Andrew, Nina, and I were constantly exhausted. It wasn't sustainable. Okay, so priority number 1, create a new job listing to post on Craigslist that might attract someone more attuned. Really, what I needed was another me, or the ability to work endless hours with no sleep and no personal time, or to pack up and leave this whole operation behind in favor of a beach in Tulum. I couldn't even remember the last time I'd been to yoga or taken Hamlet on a hike. The last time I'd dreamed of anything but invoices and health inspections. Coffee, must have coffee. Nina's scratchy voice preceded her round, flushed face. I inclined my head to the blue and white speckled percolator keeping warm next to the hearth. Just made another pot. You're a goddess. Nina was still dressed in her running clothes, a pair of tiny spandex shorts and a hot pink tank top. Her golden hair was pulled back in a sloppy ponytail. We'd been inseparable since childhood, and had drunkenly slept together a few times before settling back into a cozy, supportive friendship. She was a gifted cook, responsible for the vegetable-forward dishes that helped put our tiny kitchen on the culinary map. Nina poured us each a mug, adding a healthy splash of milk and 2 spoonfuls of sugar to mine. What time did you get here, anyway? 5. I tried not to let any exhaustion creep into my voice. Beth, Nina looked as though she might slap me. You need to get sleep, honey. Want me to do the job posting stuff? Guilt swelled in my stomach. This wasn't just about me. Being short-staffed and busier than ever meant that Nina and Andrew suffered. No, I sighed. You can get started on your prep. I can't stop thinking we're never going to find the right person. Roy was such a disappointment. Nina scoffed. Yeah, in more ways than one. A laugh bubbled up from my belly as I turned back to the oven to ensure all of the wood had caught. The temperature needed to regulate by 8:30 so I could get the first of the breads and pastries in. The door clattered open and Andrew walked in, a stormy expression eclipsing my brother's normal goofy half smile. Beth, some people outside to see you. Since the Yellow House had been awarded the best new restaurant in the Northeast by the Martin Williams Foundation, a prestigious culinary organization I'd never heard of prior to receiving the letter in the mail, we'd been bombarded with reporters, bloggers, and more diners than we could possibly keep up with. Usually, though, they didn't show up a full 4 hours before we opened for the day. Peeking through the window at the small gravel parking lot, I spotted a gleaming black Mercedes and 3 people sitting at one of the picnic tables in the garden. I wiped my hands on my apron and patted my hair, hoping that my curls hadn't dried into a frizzy mess. Dressing in the dark, I'd hardly had a moment to make sure my socks matched before dashing out of the house. A few too many times these visitors were enthusiastic with the photos, and I appeared in Instagram posts or blog entries looking like a wild and unruly thing. Good morning, I called as I bounded down the stairs. The morning air brushed cool against my clammy skin. Before the fire settled down, the kitchen tended to get unbearably hot. The sunlight had gathered itself into soft rays that glistened off the dew in the vegetable and herb patches. A monarch butterfly fluttered across my path, and I paused, letting it take its time. Medusa, the barn cat turned restaurant mascot, snoozed on one of the picnic tables, blissfully oblivious to the visitors. At the sound of my voice, all 3 of them stood, a tall, slim man in a beautifully tailored suit, a shorter man with a ruddy, irritable face, and another person with their back to me. She turned. Immediately, my cheeks heated, and an awkward laugh bubbled up from my throat. She was like something plucked from my adolescent queer fantasies, bad boy and tough woman rolled into one. She wore jeans, a thick leather belt, and a white t-shirt with the sleeves cuffed a few times to reveal sinewy biceps. Her dark blonde hair was pushed back from her flawless, angular face in a messy, not quite pompadour. Straight eyebrows, a few shades darker than her hair, a long, delicate nose, lips that probably would have been ample were they not pressed together in a tense frown. How can I help you folks? I bit back the comment that we didn't open until 11 and offered a sweet smile instead. The woman stepped forward without missing a beat, extending her hand. I closed the gap between us, shivering as her long fingers brushed my palm. Her skin was warm and a little work rough. A heavy quiet settled over me as we shook hands. I had the strange thought that I could have held her hand all day. Up close, I realized her narrow, wary eyes were a soft shade of green. They widened for a fraction of a second before she stepped back, shoving her hands into her pockets. I'm Ada Campbell, the new executive chef at Bella Vista. This is Sean Jacobs, our GM, and Ricardo Visconti, the head of our restaurant group. Beneath the formal veneer of her words, her voice thrummed with life. Her accent wasn't quite southern, more country than anything else. It was the sound of humid thunderstorms and steaming biscuits slathered in home-churned butter. I never wanted her to stop talking. I exchanged a far briefer handshakes with the 2 men. Well, lovely to meet you. I fiddled with a stray curl that kept bouncing in and out of my peripheral vision. I'm Beth Summers, the madwoman behind this whole operation. I jabbed my thumb back at the house. I had no earthly idea what Bella Vista was. To be fair, though, I hadn't eaten at another restaurant in ages. Most of my meals consisted of late-night affairs, conjured up after the final guests left for the night. I developed the bad habit of burrowing into my life so deep, I sometimes forgot a world outside of the Yellow House existed. The angry-looking man, whose name I'd promptly forgotten, glared at the cottage behind me like it had single-handedly murdered his entire family. So, the Williams Award, huh? Pretty big deal. How are you guys handling the attention? I bet you're getting a lot more customers than you're used to. He was talking to me like I was a child running a lemonade stand with her parents' money. I shrugged and smoothed my apron, letting the pleasant texture of the coarse linen distract me from the unpleasantness of this man's voice. It's been a wild few months, that's for sure. Lots of folks from away coming up to eat here, but it's amazing to build a community of people who really care about good food. The sun inched higher in the sky. I needed to get back inside, put the first loaves of sourdough in the oven, and start prepping the berries for the tarts. A long, tense silence stretched between us. Normally, I would have invited them in for coffee and a few fat slices of peach cake left over from last night's dessert service. But something about the three of them unsettled me. The fancy suit, the rough demeanor, and, well, I didn't have time to think about why Ada had me all out of alignment. I read your interview in Bread and Wine. Sounds like you take the whole farm to table thing pretty seriously. Mr. Jerkface said farm to table like a particularly foul swear word. Sure do. I plastered a smile on my face. I felt like a politician when all I wanted to do was stop talking and start working. My dad's a lobsterman and my mom ran this place as a coffee shop my whole life. This is my home, and I want the food to reflect that, to taste both familiar and exciting. As much as I meant it, it was a canned response, one I'd given a dozen or so times since people started asking me silly questions about my culinary philosophy, whatever in the world that meant. What's your staff situation look like? I half expected this guy to pull out his phone and start recording. Ada and the fancy suit dude exchanged a meaningful look. Well, I trailed off for a long moment, letting the irritation creep up my throat just a little more. I didn't owe these people anything, and they still hadn't told me what they wanted. Was this a thing big shot restaurant people did? Drive out to small town eateries and pester the owners with weird questions? I sighed. It's just me, my best friend Nina, and my brother Andrew in the kitchen, plus Ahmed, our front of house superstar, and our two servers. I left out the fact that one of said servers spent most of his time on shift getting stoned, and that I was desperately in need of about 5 more people I could not possibly afford to pay a decent wage, which meant I was a living, breathing poster child for overwork. I rolled my neck and inhaled deeply. That's a pretty lean operation. Ada shot me an unreadable expression. Usually I could get a sense of a person's energy within the first few minutes of meeting them, understand who they were and what they were looking for. My mom called it empathy. My brother called me a psychic. Really, people just made sense to me, but not this woman. Ada squinted back at the cottage, shielding her eyes with her elegant hand. Smoke poured from the stone chimney. Fuck. I'd forgotten to adjust the flue before rushing outside, and the fire had gotten too hot. In all likelihood, the kitchen temperature had climbed from hot as hell to face-meltingly sweltering, meaning my dough would be trash. This little conversation had cost me a good 30 minutes of work. Now, instead of slipping the breads into the oven, I'd have to tamp the flames, start over my choux pastry, and recalibrate my entire morning. No way in hell was I getting the job posting today. Looks like your oven's burning too hot. Ada nodded, a sharp, definitive motion. Suddenly, rage engulfed me, whole and scalding. Maybe it was the exhaustion, maybe it was the ache in my lower back, maybe it was the fact that after years spent running away from my hometown, I was still reeling from my decision to come back. When I spoke, my voice was brittle and too loud, unfamiliar. Thanks, I know that. You all have been taking up my morning, and I have to say I'm not quite sure why. So if you need something, please enlighten me. Otherwise, I have to get back to work. Probably by most standards, I wasn't being that rude. The few disastrous months I'd spent in culinary school had taught me that most chefs and bakers carried explosive tempers beneath their neatly starched whites. But that wasn't me, at least not usually. At my words, Ada visibly stiffened and took a step away from me, her face going from unreadable to stormy. Mr. Jerkface muttered something under his breath. The guy in the slick suit stepped forward, the perfect picture of hospitality polish. Of course, his voice was heavily accented and butter smooth. We've been terribly rude. Allow me to apologize and to explain. My restaurant group is opening a new fine dining spot in town, Bella Vista, as Chef Campbell mentioned. None of us are from the area, and we wanted to get to know some of the other local talent. Your restaurant has made quite the impression, and we wanted to see it for ourselves. But of course, I understand how busy you must be. He shot me a winning smile and handed me a business card. Please come by any time. Our soft opening is in 2 weeks. We would love to see you there. I wanted to be gracious, but my words remained bitter and harsh, like tea brewed too strong. Well, thanks for stopping by. Like I said, I have to get back to work. I should have turned on my heel then, marched back into the cottage, and poured myself a fresh cup of coffee. Instead, my mouth kept moving a good 50 paces ahead of my brain. Besides, I don't think we'll have a big overlap in business, so you shouldn't worry. The cruise ship crowd doesn't make it out to Port Catherine all that much. If you're looking to get a better sense of your competition, I recommend you stop by Caruso's on the waterfront. Okay, now I was definitely being rude, both to these folks and the poor Caruso family, who ran a perfectly respectable, if old school, seafood place. Sure, I was frustrated by the influx of people from Boston and Manhattan coming up to Maine to buy property, drive up rents, and replace family-run businesses with soulless corporate operations. But I had no idea what this Bella Vista restaurant was even going to be. And really, I thought it was nice that they were reaching out personally to other businesses. An apology was on the tip of my tongue when the kitchen window clattered open and Nina's blonde head popped out. Beth, sorry to bother you, babe, but what's his face at Moonbeam Farm just called? I guess the storm the other night wiped out his spinach. Andrew says we have a little bit left in our beds, but either way, we need to totally rethink tonight's menu. I could do the tomato and green garlic orecchiette again, but she trailed off, probably aware that she was shouting her stream of consciousness thoughts across the courtyard. After holding up a finger and shooting my best friend an amused eye roll, I turned back to the group. Fancy suit guy was once again extending his manicured hand, politely thanking me for my time. I tried for my kindest smile and stammered an approximation of an apology for my earlier rudeness and busy morning. But Ada, the one I'd oddly wanted to hear my words, had stalked away. She leaned against the car, arms crossed over her chest, infuriating blank expression on her face. I was too damn busy for this kind of thinking, but for a brief moment, I thought she looked like the tough greasers I'd fantasized about after devouring The Outsiders when I was assigned it as a summer reading book in 7th grade. I imagined the rough feel of her hands on my face, tangling into my hair, the soft brush of her lips against mine. She would smell like soap and citrus with a slightly spicy base note, and she would taste... Nope, no way. Not going there. I needed to focus. I had a restaurant to run. So that is chapter 2 of my book. And that's kind of the meet cute between Ada and Beth, the two protagonists. So yeah, they don't really get off on the best foot, but it's a romance novel. So obviously they get to know each other better and like each other more. So yeah, with the next little bit of time, I figured I would just talk a little bit about queer romance in general and why I write queer romance novels, and then we'll have some time for questions after that. So yeah, my book came out with Carina Press, which is an imprint of Harlequin, the big romance publisher. And Carina has this line called Adores, which is all LGBTQ romances, and they're all contemporary and all kind of similar-ish in tone. They're pretty, none of them are very dark. So I was really excited to be one of the first books to come out with the Adores line, because I think it's really important to have positive queer stories. I'm just about to turn 30 next month, and growing up, there was some LGBTQ representation in media, but a lot of it was, like Will and Grace I saw sometimes, or things like that, but there wasn't a lot of really positive, just sort of quotidian day-to-day stories about, gay people falling in love and being happy. So it's pretty fun to write stories that are comforting and, kind of confectionery about my community. So yeah, let's see, other topics about, so I also write young adult literature and middle grade, but I haven't published any of those books yet because I'm a really slow writer. But similarly, I just think it's very, very important to have, really positive representation, which is not to say that they can't be complex, and it has to be really, kind of light and fluffy. But I want, for kids and adults alike who identify as, you know, somewhere on the LGBTQ plus spectrum to have media that makes them happy and makes them feel seen. So yeah, and I have a couple of other gay romance novels that I have out. My first book was called Love on the Hudson, and that's a gay male romance set in upstate New York, which was really fun to write. It was my first like real crack at writing a novel. And it's, you know, it's a debut novel, so I think I've gotten better at writing, hopefully, as I've, you know, written more books. But then I also wrote a Christmas gay romance, which is set in the Teton Valley, and that was really fun to write. And I mean, I know when that movie Happiest Season came out this past winter, people had a lot of feelings about it, and I think that that's almost unfair because there's just so little, you know, gay holiday fun movies and books like that, you know, if there were more, there wouldn't be so much pressure on them, I don't think. So anyway, yeah, those are some of the other books that I've written. And then I wrote The Secret Ingredient. I moved to Maine about 3 years ago and really love living here. You know, my family's from New England, but I had lived for a long time in the Midwest. And it was so nice to be in a beautiful place with, you know, the outdoors and things like that. And I also really love to cook. I love watching cooking shows and trying new recipes. And I'm not a great baker, but I love baking. So I thought it would be fun to kind of combine just a bunch of things that I really like into a book. So I wrote The Secret Ingredient and had a lot of fun with it. So yeah, I think now I can go ahead and open it up to questions if people have anything, and you can just feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question, or if you prefer, type it in the chat too, that's fine. So yeah, if anybody has any questions or anything, I'm happy to answer them.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
So you talked a bit about Happiest Season, and there's sort of been this drive in publishing for a few years now, the Own Voices drive. Why do you think it's so crucial, if you had to narrow it down, for queer people to tell queer stories?
I mean, it's something I've definitely thought about a lot as a romance and as a writer for young readers. And I think it's just, it kind of comes down to me to authenticity. I think, you know, I wouldn't really be super comfortable writing outside of my lane, like in terms of things like race or, you know, even things like, you know, socioeconomic status. Like I don't really want to speak to someone's lived experience that's really different from mine. And, you know, it's a little weird because it is fiction. You are creating a fictional narrative and hopefully doing it justice no matter what. And I think that, you know, within reason, you can write outside of your lived experience for sure. And, you know, if it's something that you feel really uncomfortable with, you know, doing your research and hiring sensitivity readers who are from that community. But I think it's just really great to have own voices, which for anybody who's not familiar with that term, it just means it's your own voice speaking. You're writing from your own experiences within your community. Yeah, I think that it really does just come down to being able to tell like a rich story of drawing from things that you know. And I think that, you know, it just also makes for better art, you know, and debatable whether you think romance novels really qualify as art. I happen to, but you know, I think drawing from what you know means you're writing with a lot of confidence and with a lot more complexity. So yeah, and I know within like the terrible world of publishing Twitter, there's always a lot of debates about own voices and, you know, authors having to kind of come out or, you know, be really public about their identity. And I think that that's, you know, a hard conversation, but at the end of the day, for me, it really does just boil down to, being able to speak really confidently and eloquently about what you know and care about. And I think you'll tell better stories. So yeah, hopefully that answers the question. Oh, and I see there's something in the chat. Okay. Okay, so there's a question in the chat. Have I worked in a restaurant? Not in a restaurant specifically. I worked in a cooking school and / like cookware store in college when I was in undergrad in Chicago. And I learned a lot. I worked with a lot of chefs, which was kind of an interesting thing as like a slightly sheltered person who was in my very early 20s. I saw a lot of pretty like hard living chefs but also learned so much. And then I just did a lot of research for this book, like watched that show Chef's Table and a lot of like read a lot of culinary memoirs and things like that. And then it also says, were you influenced by any gay, male, or lesbian owned restaurants? I wasn't. I would love to know of more gay or lesbian owned or queer owned restaurants in Maine or really anywhere. I'm sure there are plenty, because I think that the queer community is pretty like well represented in the culinary world. But yeah, that's a really good question, and now I kind of want to look into that more. So okay, and I see another question in the chat. It says, is there a type of story within the queer space that you want to tell, character, age group, circumstance, that you haven't yet? Yeah, that's a really great question. Yes, there are so many. I tend to lean toward wanting to tell pretty, positive, uplifting stories. But I really, really love, especially in my writing for young readers, I really like writing historical fiction because I think it is cool and really important to be able to see yourself reflected in the past, and not just the present and not just the future, but to see that, there have been gay people around forever, and that a lot of our narratives have been written out of or erased from history, and to see queer people thriving in history is really meaningful to me. I really love reading about LGBT history. And so, yeah, I'm working on now in very early draft form, a young adult novel that's historical, and a middle grade novel that's set in the 1960s space race. And I haven't really tapped into the gay or lesbian romance historical genre, just because it's kind of really specific, and there's a lot of like the readership is just really different, and it's something I don't know as much about. But it'd be a really cool project eventually with time and a lot of research to be able to write a gay Regency romance or something like that. I think would be really fun. I just tend to be a really intense researcher, and I get bogged down in that. So it might not be for like a decade or something. But yeah, that's a great question.
You mentioned you mentioned that part of your inspiration for writing is putting out media that reflects diverse stories, and that there was a dearth of that, or is a dearth of that, as you were growing up in the present. But was there anything that spoke to you, either as a kid or adolescent or as an adult, that inspired you? And did it inspire you to start writing, or had you already been doing that? And can you talk about, maybe say what that is and what resonated with you?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thanks. So yeah, I mean, when I was a teenager, I was always a really big reader when I was like a kid and a teen. And I really loved reading, like YA novels. And I would admittedly go to Barnes and Noble, like with my dad, and just kind of surreptitiously look at the books to see if there was anything. And I wasn't like an out kid or anything, but I just kind of wanted to see if there was anything that like looked gay. And I would buy books that had like confused in the title and things like that. But I didn't really discover a lot of, queer fiction until I was well into my adulthood. And I'd always been a pretty big romance reader as well. I found it really fun as like a great way to kind of escape on my commute or whatever, to just read, romance because it's such a fun, for me, an immersive genre. So I guess those things kind of came together for me when I was in my 20s and discovered queer romance novels and a couple of authors that I really love, that I would recommend checking out if you like to read queer romance. Roan Parrish was one of the first authors that I found, and her books, she primarily, I think almost exclusively, writes about gay men. But I just like really was so drawn to her stories and really felt like, wow, it was really cool to just, read about gay people falling in love, and for it to be really kind of all of the comfort of romance with all of the like feeling seen that I got from queer stories. And then, when I was a younger person too, I think I still do love a lot of those like kind of tragic queer narratives that maybe some people are trying to move away from. Like I love and still love to this day both the book and the movie Brokeback Mountain. I think it's really beautiful. And I also really loved, even though it is extremely tragic and hard to watch, the movie Boys Don't Cry. Like really, I think I watched it on an airplane when I was like a teenager, and it really resonated with me. So yeah, that was a good question. Thanks.
I have a follow-up question because you had mentioned that tragedy versus comfort, and I don't know that much about the romance genre, but you had kind of made I feel like you've made some comment touched on the genre itself and sort of what some of its goals are, what are some of its strengths, and I would love you to kind of maybe if you could kind of expound on that a little bit. You'd mentioned like comfort and the importance of happy endings, but um, I'm getting a sense of the difference between like a love story and a romance novel, if that's a better way of asking.
Yeah, totally. So romance, I feel like, is definitely defined by having a happily ever after. The characters have to end up together for it to be a romance. And there are a lot of really beautiful love stories. I think Brokeback Mountain is one of them, for example, that are gorgeous and resonant and so moving, but they're not, romances because the two characters don't end up together. So something that I think I really love about romance, and I think it's why it's such a popular genre. Last I checked, I think romance is still the best-selling genre. And anyway, so yeah, I mean, just having your expectations met is something that we find so rarely, I think, in adult life. That when you open a romance novel and read it, that it will be, even if the author really like puts the characters through the ringer, they're going to end up together. And I think there's a lot of comfort in that. And I would argue, especially for queer readers and writers, to know that that story is going to end up happy, and that people are going to get what they want, including the reader. There's just a lot of, I think, comfort and a lot of power in that. And, I tend to really enjoy a lot of contemporary romances as a reader, that just have like beautiful scenery, and you can just immerse yourself in this world that is, different from our kind of challenging day-to-day life. And it doesn't mean everything has to be perfect. Like I will admit, as an author, I have a pretty hard time like torturing my characters. Every romance novel has what's called the black moment, which is like when the characters will either break up or there'll be, some really rocky patch in their relationship. And for me, it's a really hard section of a book to write. But I think, it's really wonderful to see characters come through adversity together and, end up and be happy. So it's something I really enjoy about romance and has always drawn me to the genre.
Sorry, I don't want to keep asking all the questions if anyone wants to jump in, but how do you keep, if you're working within those parameters, like you've written 3 books now and maybe are working on more, what are ways as an author that you think about like keeping stories fresh and like pulling, knowing that your readers have a expectation of where the destination of the story will be? Like, how do you make that journey entertaining or unexpected for that? Is that something that is one of your goals, or like how do you I guess think about as a writer like building suspense in within parameters that are maybe baked into the genre?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's hard. I think it's a hard thing to do in any book, but in romance, especially because you are kind of following these really traditional beats, you do have to toe a line between, you know, like it being completely expected and almost boring. And for me, it really comes down to, I try to write in a way that's very character driven. So I want to know exactly who my characters are and really care about them. And I think if I'm coming from a place of writing in a character driven way and I care about the characters, then hopefully my readers will too. And I think if you have really well written, well thought out, complex characters, the plot will emerge from that. And also the plot doesn't really matter as much. Like, I know within young adult publishing especially, there's been this real push for these like big splashy very plot driven books, and at least for me, and everybody's different, but I don't find those as fun to read because I really care a lot more about characters. Like, I could read a book, I think the book Normal People, which is a great love story, not a romance really, but is a great example of that. Not a ton really happens in that book, but you really care about the characters, or at least I did. And it's interesting because those characters are interesting. And then, there are other things too. I think obviously trying to work on your craft so that at the sentence level, things really resonate, that can make readers feel like they're in good hands and like, they feel seen by what they're reading. So hopefully that answers the question. Anybody else? All right. Well, if anybody has any other questions, again, I'm happy to answer them, but otherwise, yeah, that's about all I have. I mean, I could probably ramble on more about romance and writing. Oh, here we go. We've got another question. What's your writing process like? Hard. I don't know. I am a pretty slow writer, unfortunately. I really struggle with drafting. I just finished up reading I'm in an MFA program at Vermont College of Fine Arts, and I just finished reading this book called Bird by Bird, which has a section in it called Shitty First Drafts. And it's basically about like, just write a terrible first draft and be okay with it. And that's been really helpful to me because I struggle with that so much. So yeah, my writing process is slow, but I'm working pretty hard to get in a better, routine. For a while, I was getting up really early every day and writing. And I do find that writing comes easier to me if I write consistently. I think it's like anything else. If you are someone who, I don't really know about like other hobbies, but like I like to run, and I know that the more I run, the easier it is because my body is just, kind of ready to do it. And I think with writing, it's really similar. So, and I also try to read pretty widely. I find if I'm reading a lot of things that are really similar to what I'm drafting, that I start to kind of borrow another author's voice, which, can be fine. I don't think that's a bad thing necessarily, but I find that when I'm drafting, it's really helpful to read, if I'm writing a romance, I might read a couple of romances at the beginning and then try to read some like literary fiction and poetry and things like that And I also try to write down like sentences from other books and poems that I think are really beautiful, and kind of think about like what's the author doing, and how can I incorporate that into my own work, but in a way that is not just, you know, stealing their voice, but something that I can learn from them. So, and then I really like revising. I find that piece of the writing process to be a lot more gratifying and honestly a little bit easier, because once I have my draft down, I'm not so scared of it, and it's easier for me to just like tear it all apart and put it back together again. So yeah. Yeah, if anybody has any other questions, I guess I will say if you're interested in reading, you know, The Secret Ingredient or any of my other books, I'm on social media, Katie Fisher author, and you can find me on there. And I have a website and stuff. So, and my books are available on Amazon and at libraries, and you know, local bookstores. You can, some of them you can order them through, especially The Secret Ingredient is pretty widely available. Oh, and I see another question in the chat. Who is your favorite character you've ever written and why? Oh, that's a really good question. My favorite character actually might be Ada from The Secret Ingredient. She's a character that I based on this old movie. I think it was like on HBO called If These Walls Could Talk Too. And there's like kind of like a tough butch character played by Chloe Sevigny in one of the little vignettes in the movie. And I loved that vignette, and I liked her character a lot. So I kind of wanted to do something based on that, but it was a pretty thin, you know, excuse to start writing this character. But then I started thinking a lot about who she really is, and it was so fun to come up with her backstory. And it was pretty cool to write a single mom character. I am not a single parent or a parent at all. I have 2 dogs, but it's definitely not like having a child. So it was really fun to dig into that. And she comes from, she's supposed to have grown up in Missouri in a pretty intensely religious family. And it was really kind of hard to write about some of the trauma that she experienced, but also really, I felt like by the end of thinking through her character, and I tend to write like little character sketches at the beginning and then can get way too into it. And after thinking through her character, I really cared about her a lot, and I felt really strongly that I wanted her to be happy. So yeah, she's probably my favorite. I also tend to write, I really like writing characters who are farmers for some reason. I feel like it always sneaks into my writing in some way. So in my Christmas book, like one of the characters is an organic farmer in Idaho, and he was really fun to write. I love to garden and grow vegetables and stuff. So it was fun to bring those pieces of like my own hobby into that character too. But yeah, if anyone is interested in reading this, like I said, it's available. And I highly recommend the other books in the Karina Adores line. If you're someone who enjoys queer romance or just romance in general, there's a lot of different titles and a really diverse group of authors. There's gay male, you know, there's bisexual, lesbian, there's some trans stories. So I highly, highly recommend just the line of books generally. And they all are pretty happy and light, which is, you know, there's, in my book, you know, there's a character who has some pretty serious trauma that she's grappling with, but the tone, I would say, of all of those books is pretty pretty positive. So if that's something that you enjoy, I highly recommend them.
Excellent. Well, if no one else has a question, I think that'll do it for tonight. What do you think, Katie?
That sounds great. Thank you all so much for coming. I know it was a really beautiful, warm afternoon, so I appreciate everybody, sitting in front of a computer instead of being outside. Like I know that I will probably still do even though the sun's setting. So I really appreciate everybody coming. Thank you so much. And thank you so much to the Rockland Library. This was wonderful.
And thank you, Katie, for wonderful reading and talk. And have a good night, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.